This, the podcast designed to help software testers understand risk and adopt new testing solutions with ease and confidence. Your host is Mahamadou, a quality assurance consultant with over 10 years of experience across multiple industries. In each episode, he'll talk to different experts and learn from them about how they test.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, everyone, for joining. Today, I'm excited to welcome Paul McCollum. Paul McCollum is a true Salesforce heavyweight. He is a Salesforce MVP and Enterprise Architect. He is a three-time Dreamforce speaker and user group champion. He is a recognized community leader behind events such as We Dreamin and Architect Dreamin. And he's also an author of the book, Practical Salesforce Architecture. So thank you, Paul, for being here and for being open to share your experience.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah. So today we'll mainly discuss about how to move from a role like admin, a developer, testers like I am, towards an architecture role. We'll start with Paul's background and experience. Then we'll define what is a Salesforce architect. After that, we'll talk about the common mistakes aspiring architects tend to make. Then we'll discuss practical advice on things to learn to become a good architect. And after that, we'll share some first steps to get started in your journey if you're interested in this role. So without further ado, let's get started. So thank you for being here. First of all, I wanted to ask you, how did you get into Salesforce in the first place?
I looked into it when I was working with the company 7-Eleven, and they were looking for a tool to help manage their franchisee communication pathways. And they were shopping for something very bespoke, built to do franchise retail or convenience store communication. And I didn't want them to buy something that was built for a very small audience. So looking at what they were trying to do, and it was really more around mobile workforce management. And if you consider the franchisees, they're not employees, but they're more people that we try and convince to use our or use 7-Eleven's best practices. I kind of tried to envision them as a customer that the regional management was trying to sell best practice and product selection to. So I spent about a year learning Salesforce, trying to get 7-Eleven to use it, as it was a best in breed tool with a lot of functionality and not very limited. So spent a year learning it and pitching it internally, finally landed the project, ended up competing in a competition for innovation on the Salesforce platform. And then that got me to Dreamforce. I was one of the winners selected for that, which got me to Dreamforce and exposed me to the Ohana and kind of the spirit and fun in being a Salesforce practitioner. So that's what started me there. And I went after another couple of years or a couple of months of doing exams and training on Trailhead. I took a job at Accenture as a cloud consultant and have been full-time pretty much inside the Salesforce ecosystem since then.
Thank you. Congratulations. How did you evolve starting as a developer to become an enterprise architect, chief AI, or even a speaker?
Well, that's a bunch of different answers. So I got lucky and grew up around technology, or at least I gravitated to it very early. And so I was putting computers together in 1978, sneaking into libraries to use their computers. I got online early when I was like 11 to early bulletin board systems, again, putting together primitive computers. So I got lucky and was exposed to the way computer and network infrastructures worked when they were just being born. So they were very simple things when they first came out, and I got to learn them piece at a time over the many years that it took to develop them. So I've got a very clear picture of my head of all the network infrastructure, and everything that's come after, I've been lucky to be able to add it in one piece at a time. Now it's fairly complex, and if you're trying to learn it from scratch, it's a lot to take in. So it really didn't start with, and I'd written code since I was probably in the second grade. So had always been programmer, but also networker. Computers weren't complex enough to need different disciplines. So I diversified when I moved down to Dallas and kind of leaned into development a little bit. And then got a job at Nortel Networks, which was a big telecom company laying the foundation for the modern high-speed internet. And within a year of being a developer there, I moved into the kind of an enterprise architect role there, just because I was a developer that understood firewalls and networks and modem pools and databases better than most people who had just kind of started and focused on one of those things.
I see. And moving from roles to roles, what's the most important lesson you've learned over the years? Because you have over 20 years of experience.
So people, I think, are the greatest resource. I think developing your communication skills, getting out and talking to people, that is probably the best way to ramp up your skills. It's very difficult to learn something from a step-by-step beginner book. And
Yeah.
once you know one system really well, you can be a senior engineer or an architect for that particular system. But to me, the differentiator between becoming an architect, being an architect, not just a solution or one particular platform, is knowing how all of those components that you learned for your one stack relate to other stacks. So a really good architect usually comes from somebody who's dug in deep on more than one system. And when you can see the similarities between those two systems, you start to understand what makes up the foundation of an architecture, where things can be slotted in, where one component is favorable to another. So I pick up a lot of that. It's takes too long and there are too many books, but I've been lucky enough to build architect friends that can, if I'm trying to learn something new, they can explain it to me in terms of something I already know that they know as well. And then I can really rapidly pick up that new architecture, that new ecosystem, the new vocabulary, and start to work in it.
Okay, great. And what qualities does a great Salesforce architect must have to succeed in this role?
You have to be one of the things. Well, one, you have to constantly be learning. And for a Salesforce architect, it's really important to keep abreast of what tools are out there, so that you don't develop things that have already been built up. You don't want to reinvent the wheel.
Yeah.
The other important parts of the Salesforce architecture, it's important to understand when you are exceeding kind of the normal scale for Salesforce. Salesforce is amazing at doing things for small to medium business. If you have few users, under 100 users, you're probably not going to break Salesforce. If you're not loading a ton of data, not trying to use Salesforce as a supercomputer, you're just fine. But there are certain thresholds that you'll cross over that you need to know when Salesforce native isn't the right thing, the right solution for the problem. So you can be an engineer or a solution architect in Salesforce, but if you want to be a more senior, closer to enterprise architect, you've got to know where those scale components are. You've got to know, you don't have to know what a database is to do Salesforce solution architecture, but if you're putting millions of records into Salesforce, that comes with some caveats around how the Salesforce database system is set up. And if you don't know database fundamentals, then the limitations that start to come into play for the Salesforce database won't make sense to you.
Yeah, totally get it. And what observation have you seen that makes you write this book, Practical Salesforce Architecture?
Pretty much almost exactly that. I spent a long time arguing with a very senior enterprise architect, trying to explain to him how Salesforce worked behind the scenes. Famously, he was just positive that he had 3 or 4 instances of Salesforce out there, and he wanted to know where each one of them was. And he knew they were separate because they all had the word cloud at the end of them. So he had Sales Cloud, he had Service Cloud, he had Experience Cloud, and there was one other one, and they were all basically software packages installed on the same platform. But the way Salesforce labeled them made them sound like they were entirely different offerings that had distinct ecosystems behind them. And so he's trying to understand them in a very classical architecture, and a very common sense naming problem for Salesforce is calling these software packages clouds. It was very confusing. So I spent several months trying to work with Salesforce to help and drawing a bunch of diagrams and, hey, this is what an application is for you. This is what an application is for Salesforce. They're fundamentally different definitions, and they were very challenging to try and explain. But once I did, I had the first couple chapters of a book, and eventually I had O'Reilly reach out to me and ask me to write a book on flows, and I countered with, I'd like to write one on how to understand Salesforce architecture in terms of classical architecture. And so that's the book I wrote, is kind of trying to take all the marketing terms and all the weird naming schemas that Salesforce uses and make them easier to understand for people who've built things in other platforms.
The naming convention is very complicated with Salesforce.
Yeah.
And now, can you talk more about what you do in a day-to-day, like your task and responsibilities?
I tend to spend a lot of time trying to communicate amongst different siloed teams. There'll be a data architecture team that manages things either in terms of which database systems they're using or which data for which type of customer or products goes where. Everybody has a different distribution of data. People have a different distribution of which systems serve which users. And so I try to learn where those patterns are and help lean into them. Salesforce is really good at doing a lot of different things, and people who work in Salesforce can have an uncomfortable tendency to try and do everything in Salesforce, where there might be a better system. Hey, user complaints, we don't need to rewrite and build a new system for user complaints. There's already a very healthy system. We need to get people over there. If there's data we need to pull it back in and not create a duplicate of that system, which would lead to confusion and a functional mismatch, and then having to share advisory on the way some people have ownership on a certain type of customer. And if you make them learn a new application or they have to maintain business logic in two different places, that's a problem. So mostly I'm trying to track those type of patterns and make sure that what's built in Salesforce follows along with the corporate productivity layout. And if we're going to bite off something away from somebody's, an existing system, that we have the approvals to do it and that we align with the product life cycle of that system as well. So, hey, we think we could sunset this system and save money if we move this into Salesforce and have a better experience for the user. Most of the time, that's what I'm doing. Sometimes it's solving pathways and security problems, making sure PCI is protected along a data pathway, so that when it gets to Salesforce, it's not compromised, or the fact that we got it into Salesforce didn't expose the data someplace else. So it's keeping eyes on a lot of balls that aren't necessarily, there's not necessarily a trailhead around.
Can you share also an example of a project where it was successful and you played a key role as an architect? It could be a fictional or real example.
Yeah, there was a quick example, and I'm kind of proud of it. It was interesting. I was working on a project that had multiple project teams, and they were building out requirements from the client, and the client knew where the data came from. And they started telling the development team where to get this data, that data, and I think it was from Workday. So there was a Workday repository. The client worked in Workday all day long. That's where their data was, and they needed XYZ data pulled into Salesforce. So the team started to build drivers and connectors and packages to connect to Workday. I had a little bit of oversight with that, and I had just established some communications with people that knew the data infrastructure. And even though the data came from Workday, they already had a system that integrated with Workday and brought data into a place where it was supposed to be consumed by any other application. So if we'd finished building out that project and proposed a custom integration to this tool that already had a corporate approved integration pathway, we would have ended up throwing away that code, having to rewrite everything, and starting over. But fortunately, I kind of vetted that design layout outside of the project team and outside of the business team with a higher level technical team, and fixed that problem and kept us from wasting, probably $100,000 worth of development effort. Would have been most of the budget of that project.
Okay, got it. Thank you very much. Now that we understand what an architect is, let's talk about the common mistakes. First of all, can you share some common misconception you've heard about the role of architect?
Architect is a pretty badly abused term in the ecosystem. It's really hard to define the role, and I have a lot of trouble if I'm when I go look at new positions, or somebody talks to me about positions and they're seeking an architect. There's a lot of different definitions of what people think's an architect or what they title a job. So architect became something that a senior developer got promoted to, and so that's a software architect, but they don't always make the distinction between an architect and a software architect. When you're working inside of one particular stack, maybe not building code, but if you're only working in Salesforce, I usually call that a solution architect. And that's somebody who can use Salesforce components to build a solution. The architect, to me, and I end up in fights over this a lot, it's not a commonly held definition, but to me, an architect is somebody who coordinates the interactions between multiple systems. You can be inside of Salesforce an architect. Megan and I famously agreed on, if you haven't at least done like a federation with Salesforce to Okta or some other identity management, Azure Active Directory, those kind of things, probably not really fully in the role of architect. You've got to be talking multiple paradigms. Now, Salesforce has a bunch of different paradigms in it, so I think it can be. You can be an architect and be effective inside of Salesforce when you're only working in Salesforce, because you understand how flows work and Marketing Cloud works. Those are two different systems, even though they're both Salesforce. Flows to objects there's a lot of different meta concepts within Salesforce that would kind of qualify as multiple system type of architect. But to me, that's the hard one. Whether you're stitching Salesforce together with other systems versus just working inside of Salesforce by itself. That's a big distinction and a big misconception that I feel is out there. Or that you're a senior developer. I get a lot of calls where somebody, we want an architect. Oh, okay, what systems are you working together? Oh, we're not. We just need somebody who knows how to write requirements, do business analysis, work with the customer, and do everything end to end, write code, deploy code, troubleshoot code, and that's it. They want a full stack engineer as opposed to an architect, which, like the more purest role of that is somebody who's writing plans and maintaining multiple views of an ecosystem, users to functionality to systems to other systems, and so on.
Okay. I heard you talk about development, for example. Do you think it's possible for other roles to move directly from, for example, admin, tester, developer, analyst to architect directly?
I think you can. It all depends on how much, like if you're a tester, but you're only a tester of Salesforce flows or one language, and you're not working in multiple pieces of software, or you just run your test and you don't understand why this happens, why that happens behind the scenes. But if you've got a curious mind and you go out and analyze why everything's working the way it does, and you get enough information, if you do testing on multiple system architectures, and you go out and learn those architectures and why you would put something in one architecture versus a different architecture, why you would use one function as opposed to another function, why you'd use Apex and instead of flows, and why you wouldn't want to use both. Yeah, you definitely can. You just have to reach out to those concepts, learn those different paradigms, and then do that. It's not something you just kind of end up graduating up to from being a very good tester. You have to have broken down the systems behind the scenes and absorb that information from the people you're working with. Testers have very good exposure to senior people to get information from, and usually architects or developers will tell you why they did something, why they didn't, and you can accumulate that architect knowledge.
Okay, I got it. Do you have in mind another other common mistakes we tend to make when we're moving to an architect role?
Um, the biggest one I see is if you're moving from a Salesforce architect or a Salesforce position into an architect position, there's a tendency to want to win arguments. The thing that's really hard for people to get used to when you dig into a stack well enough to know its real architecture, its foundational components at the architecture level, it's very hard not to love that ecosystem and expect that ecosystem to win every battle. And you become the protagonist for everything should work like Salesforce wants it to work. A good architect makes it work the best for the business. It makes it work best for the problems at hand and for the long term, maximizing the ROI on the solution. So you have to be ready to lose. You're constantly bringing up multiple solutions, and you'll have a favorite one, but somebody else may, oh yeah, we can't spend the money this quarter. Even if it would save us a bunch of money over the future, even if this system is being deprecated and will no longer be used after next year, we still only have, we need to get this over the finish line, and the only option that's viable to us is the one that's you're not recommending. And you have to not take that personally and understand and actually embrace that, because those are, non-technical elements of architecture, and the technical piece is only one part of the architectural milk stool. Resource requirements, hey, we only have Java developers, we don't have Apex developers, and we don't want to teach them flows. Okay, I get it. We'll stay away from, then most of our solutions will just be flows, and we'll put something else to mitigate the fact that we're not using flows like we should or when you should. And that's just an example. There's not a binary on Apex versus flows, but yeah, not being able to lose, not being able to weigh other things besides your own values or the academic offerings of a tool, that takes some getting used to.
Now we understand some common mistakes. Let's talk about what we should start learning so we can get practical advices. For you, what's the most important skills we should learn right away? You talk about communication, technical skills, but what's most important to get started?
Um, I don't know. One of the easiest ways is if you're just getting started, and if you've operated in a pure tester or pure admin, you're really working on the web interface of Salesforce, and there's tons of systems behind it. If you go out, if you've had problems, if you know things that have broken Salesforce that you had to tell people to start over and redo, each one of those reasons that you've had to redo it probably has a deeper system component behind it. I can suggest my book. My book goes through and talks about what the core components of Salesforce are and how they work. But the way I learned that was by hearing things breaking or trying to do stuff that people hadn't done before, and then going on to public forums and saying, hey, this broke. Why isn't this working? And it's like, oh, yeah, you can't do X, Y, Z. Why can't you embed sockle inside of a loop? Oh, well, it's because of all this. So if you don't understand something or why something broke, the easiest way to kind of gain that knowledge is just to follow that down the rabbit hole. Find people that can explain it to you, and with that, you'll start to get an idea of the deeper structures that are behind there. And if you do that enough time, you can kind of, sonar ping your way to having an understanding of what the shape of Salesforce's back end is.
Okay. Okay. And what do you think about the idea of being an architect apprentice?
To me, everybody's an architect apprentice. You're going to learn
Yeah.
some architecture concepts as you go along doing just about anything. You're learning architecture, the components, the way things work on a computer, groups of computers, the cloud, different distributed cloud elements. You work with them every day. All you have to do is just endeavor to understand how they work and when one should work over the other. An architect apprentice, like learning directly from one architect, is a way to do that. But if I were to do that, it'd be a fire and forget. I'd kind of understand somebody's resume and say, go read up on SQL versus versus NoSQL databases. What's the difference? And then come back and ask me questions about it. And then different topics like that, integrations, REST versus SOAP. Versus Kafka messaging versus other types of data transmission or integration patterns. It can be hard to just absorb it, but it can be done. You can academically learn infrastructure and architecture, but it's hard to just embody it and put it into one book of read this book and you'll be an architect. It's a different journey, I think, for just about everybody.
Okay. And as an architect, like what tools are you using in your day-to-day, for example, to communicate, or in terms of AI, for example, to make you more efficient?
I don't use a whole lot of AI right now. I use Lucid, the diagramming tool, a lot. Being able to quickly draw up a relationship between things, being able to quickly organize concepts. These are inside of the circle. These are outside of the circle. These 5 things are the same as as each other, while these 2 things are different, and here's how they are different. Quickly putting those concepts together to get people to understand why you think you need to go one way versus the other is important, especially if there's a cost associated to it. Being able to tell stories with pictures is very important. I think AI can help with some of that. There's a lot of times that I'm using terrible analogies, kind of the king of terrible analogies of apples and oranges and grapes and tomatoes and giraffes, and an analogy will only take you so far, and it's hard to keep up with those. But sometimes if you can sit down and use an art tool, or a diagramming tool or an AI art tool to draw some pictures, you can put icons and images that speak to people more than just aardvarks and giraffes and lions.
Okay. And you also said like you should know a little bit about different things like integration, data, security, design patterns. Do you specialize in one area, or do you have to be good at everything basically?
I don't know that you have to be good at everything. You have to be aware and understand where your organization's strengths are, specifically. Knowing when you might run into a problem, knowing when an unmanaged ecosystem could hurt you. Hey, we put way too much data into this database, and now we don't want to do now it's broken. We set this up, we moved this in, and we didn't tell, the database team didn't stop us from putting 10 trillion records in it, and now that database doesn't work right. So you kind of need to understand what the original scale and intent of a database was, and when you were going outside of that scope. Same thing for integration, same thing for AI, any other compute structure, sharing data, transmitting data, encrypting data. All of those things have the possibility of having foundational problems after they reach a certain scale. And if you don't have a good feel for when you're exceeding scales and when things have broken before, it can be kind of hard to learn that. So you usually learn that you learn how to
Yeah.
fly around icebergs by crashing into a bunch of them.
Yeah, I like the analogy. Okay, now we're getting to the end of this interview. Uh, I wanted to talk about how to get started and get some resources. But first of all, if a Salesforce tester comes to you and tell you, hey, I want to become an architect within 3 to 5 years, what steps would you suggest?
I mean, I would definitely find an architect mentor, or find some different infrastructure people, the cloud architects. Ask them to explain, or if they've got any diagrams about the current architecture, and then start diving into the systems you have ready access to somebody with. If you know an
Okay.
architect and you can say, hey, could you tell me about the architecture of the system you work in today? And then just understand what concerns they're going through. And once you start to understand the pattern of one system and the downfalls, then each one of those patterns usually applies to a lot of other systems. It's not going to be
Yeah.
100% match, but if you learn why um, database row lock contention happens in one database, that happens in most databases. So you'll know one of those foundational concepts. And if there's a database that doesn't have a row lock problem, then that will teach you, hey, this is what, if I'm having this kind of problem, I either fix it this way or I move my infrastructure to this other system. And you can start shopping those choices around, asking those questions. Um, and learn it. Either that or try to learn development. Development exposes a lot of the infrastructure components quicker than other roles do. You will break stuff at a level that tells you, hey, there's something else involved here. And I need to understand that concept because it tells me out of memory. I'm like, well, what memory? Which I know what memory is because I have a hard drive on my computer and I have RAM on my computer. Which type of memory is it, and why is it coming into play here inside of flows? So breaking systems and figuring out why that happens will also teach you a lot of that, if you can't just have somebody sit down and tell you all of those what things are made of and why you need to be aware of them.
I also see like you have very impressive numbers in your Trailhead account. So does it
Yeah.
helps a lot? Do you practice all the times?
It can. I mean, you can learn a lot of, Trailhead mostly teaches you about functionality and how to build stuff inside of Salesforce. Once you build stuff inside of Salesforce, it's when you break it that you actually learn kind of the constraints behind the scenes and when not to use Salesforce. So that doesn't really come very much from Trailhead. They are starting to put some more architect content inside of Trailhead. But a lot of what Salesforce produces is really solution architect content inside of Salesforce. The architect
Yeah.
evangelist team is developing some other things, but they focus on the Salesforce side primarily. So we'll see if they. I get to connect with them pretty regularly
Yeah.
now, and so we'll see where they lean into and how they're going to do kind of real world architecture from the perspective of the Salesforce team.
Okay. And do you have also example of project I can showcase in my portfolio? For example, if I'm looking for a job.
Um,
Okay.
That's interesting. Yeah, the trouble with being an architect is 90% of the valuable work that you do as an architect is preventing bad things from happening. And if they don't happen, you don't have something on your resume. Uh,
Yeah.
it's hard to show, these are the icebergs we didn't hit.
Yeah.
Just sailing from here to there is pretty easy as long as you don't hit anything along the way. You steer left to right, but all of the equipment, all of the people that are working to make sure that you don't hit any of these obstacles, that work is kind of hard to evaluate. So I've talked about this before. It is interesting to try, and I sometimes have to make a kind of a murder board of here are the teen disasters that we steered around, and we won't have this problem because architecture lent a hand. And you sometimes have to go in and very specifically list those so that people don't forget why they need an architect on a project and what kind of things could go wrong if you just focused on the happy path, built it as if everybody originally assumed, and didn't follow the guidance of an architect to make sure that the system would work well from day one and into year 5.
Okay. And is there any certifications you recommend as well?
I really liked the data architecture certification from Salesforce. I thought that
Yeah.
was um, it was not Salesforce specific. It was very global on data architecture concepts. So that is a very cross platform skill set that is hosted within Salesforce as far as a certification. So I would definitely go study that. The rest are a lot more specific to Salesforce. So if you're talking about a Salesforce architect, the architect
Yeah.
certifications are very good. But again, those are more solution architect certifications than they are architect certifications, in my humble and very well contested opinion.
Okay, got it. And is there any group you recommend to join for networking and learning with peers, for example?
I would join a lot of them. I would join several. So if you're looking to just become a Salesforce architect, you can learn that off a Trailhead. You can learn that by working directly in Salesforce. If you want to go to the enterprise architect level, I'd join an AWS group. I'd join a Kafka group. I'd join a JavaScript group, and go and try to understand the different layers that each of those work in. When somebody tells you something cool about Kafka, try and understand the server connection or why people would use it over some other system. And that exposure will, hopefully help outline what infrastructure components go into, selecting an infrastructure component and why you care about one and not the other, and when one would be valuable and when one wouldn't.
Okay, thank you. Last question for today. What is the final advice you would give to people listening to this or dream of becoming a Salesforce architect?
For Salesforce Architect, just get in the regular habit of doing trails. You're building your Salesforce solution architect. You really just are trying to learn where all the tools are, learn what it can do easily and quickly, what new functions come out, and then work in Apex, work in LWC, so you understand the strengths of each one of those. Get at least okay, and then go look through like answers.salesforce.com, Reddit, Stack Exchange, and find problems that people had. And sometimes there'll be an explanation of the problem there that will help you understand not just how to build something, but when to not build something or when to build something in favor of something else. When not. I think one of the favorite things I learned by paying attention to the true to the core was I was working on the JavaScript framework, the Lightning component framework, which is called Aura. And I was in the middle of learning it and trying to get good at it when I found out that Salesforce was discontinuing it over the next couple of years. So I stopped working on that framework and started learning LWC, which was new at the time. But I didn't know that it was going to replace Lightning components with Lightning web components. So paying attention there, knowing when to do it, but there's still some stuff that you have to do with Aura and use there's stuff that's not quite there yet. So digging into those and staying attached to those announcements and understand why they're moving away from something. And when to recommend using the new thing versus when you've got to stick with the old thing and having a plan for how to get off of it. Those are, I would say, probably the best resources for understanding Salesforce architecture better. Ramifications of what you build is important as a Salesforce architect.
So thank you, Paul. That was a valuable conversation. I've learned a lot. So thanks again for taking the time to share your insight. For anyone interested or curious, I will share your LinkedIn account so people who can reach out to you. I will share a link to your book, and I will also share a link about previous speech you've done before. So that concludes today's episode of How to Test This. So I hope you find this episode valuable. If you did, please share it with your colleagues and stay tuned for upcoming episodes. We will continue to learn from experts about their favorite tools and how to become better software tester or architect. So thank you again. This is Mamadou, and that was How to Test This. Thank you, and see you next time.